love of the game. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Bad Boys, your one-stop shop for energy drink reviews. I'm Brian.
I'm Christian.
And we are, of course, the Bad Boys. Today, we have a special guest with us. We have Coach Kell Smith. He is currently at Elon University, and he is with the baseball team as well as the men's and women's tennis teams and assisting with football. Kell, say hi to everybody, all three listeners, and if you have a chance, just give us a little bit of background on yourself, like where you started, what happened, what kind of led you to being at this point in your career.
What's up? I guess started out, I went to Wingate University for undergrad, did an internship there. Kind of started out, it was just needed an internship for classes. Hey, like working out, like the weight room, do it, realized, really loved it. Led me to Elon. After that, did another internship here, and then did a GA, was a GA for 1 year at TCU following that internship. And luckily enough, found my way back to Elon, and happy to be back. So,
long story short, wow, what a good audience. I guess before we kind of get into a couple of questions, I do have a special treat for us. This has been a recent release from one of our favorite brands. Christian, I don't know if your hunch was right, but today I got the Welch's Ghost.
See, I was actually gonna guess that other monster that you had.
The whole Blue Hawaiian.
Yeah, but that would have been my second guess.
Yeah.
Dang, dude.
So I'm gonna, without further ado, I'm just gonna pop that top here.
Ooh.
Nice crisp pop, and
pinkies up.
It's just like a grandpa's funeral, baby. Just like a grandpa's funeral.
What does that mean?
It's a very deep cut from one of our early episodes. We did a grape flavored energy drink, and we told the story of. It was Amino Energy. I told the story of, like, we talked about Juicy Juice. And I told the story of the first time I ever had Juicy Juice. It was at my grandfather's funeral, and so it like brought me back to that moment of the first time I ever tasted it. But not to get too much into energy drinks today. Obviously, we have a guest with us. Has very, very valuable thoughts. He's kind of seen different things as well as like the same principles applied in different methods and different variations across the board here. Like Kell mentioned, you said you interned at Wingate, then you came to us at Elon. So you and Christian interned with each other. That was my first year at Elon, essentially my first summer being able to have interns. Obviously, I put you guys through the ringer a little bit. But I think we had fun. And then at the end of it, you got accepted near the end of the internship too. You had been offered the job at TCU to be a graduate assistant, working with baseball, swim and dive. And was there any other sports that you had? And women's tennis. That's what it was. Worked there for a year. We had some turnover at our position. Do you want to just kind of tell the story about how you took the job to come back to Elon?
I'll let you go ahead just because I don't want to leave something out.
So obviously we had some turnover. We had posted the position, you had applied for it. And when you got offered, you didn't know if you should essentially not call it quits on TCU, but you had committed through like the graduate assistant like program. You wanted to finish that out, but obviously Zach being Zach, he's like, hey, you're in this to get a full-time job. You should take the full-time job. And then you got a call from me. So if you can just walk everybody through what that call was like.
Yeah, I get the call, and I'm kind of weighing my options, and basically Brian just asked me, trying to think of the right way to phrase this, but
you can phrase it however you want. We don't have explicit content filters.
Okay. He basically said, are you going to be a little bitch, or are you going to come work with me? And I said, I think my response was, I'm not really sure right now, but I'm trying to figure that out. But I guess I ended up not doing that, and now we don't share an office, but basically share an office.
Yeah, I spend so much time in their office. So Christian, he's at Matt's old desk, and Jake is at your old desk. So
Okay.
just changing seats, but familiar faces, which is kind of cool. Um, Christian, if you have good topics or questions at any point in time, I have a couple listed down. Obviously, I bet you do as well. But one thing I really wanted to kind of kick this off with is, you know, like I said, you had seen different levels of success and different things done at each level, right? You were a national champion when you were a baseball player at Wingate. You saw great success as an intern there in the confines of the weight room. Obviously, going to TCU, which is like the pinnacle of collegiate baseball performance. Like Zach is kind of doing everything that leads and paves the way for everybody else to kind of follow and has been for a long time. And then you come to Elon, who has, arguably a rich history of really good performance coaches in the baseball side of things. We've had Hunter Bell, who's now at Arkansas. We've had Andrew Benham, who's at UVA. We had Hunter Lakey, who was even just an intern and now is at Georgia Southern in the full time role there, doing well. Matt Law Jones came from the Astros to be at Elon, and now he's at Utah. So and now this is a long lineage, and like being in those four walls, like what's like the biggest difference that you see, I think, in terms of like even just departmental or like mind frames or like the situations of switching from one to the other? Like, do you think there is a more like kind of like one size fits all approach, at least in some like verticals or some categories? Or do you think it is all so variable depending on the teams? Like what's your ideas and kind of, I don't want to say philosophy, but your mindset on that?
Um, I mean, I think everything's kind of context dependent, um, and that goes in regard to probably like the structure of the way you want things run within your program or depending on which team you're working with. And the same thing kind of applies, I guess, training wise as well. What do you have at your disposal? What are you able to do and do well and do efficiently with that population? But also like the structure of your program or the structure of the day to day way that you run things. I think that's context dependent too, just depending on what kind of team you have. Um, your training and culture wise, like you can align those things best to fit whatever team it is. If you've got a team that's kind of shaky and probably not very good on your, I guess, accountability stuff, they're not going to hold each other accountable. They're not very self-led or self-driven, then that's a team where you might organize your training a little bit more towards that side of things, instilling values and getting them to learn to where they can eventually be that self-led group. Um, or it's a team that's, maybe they have really good leaders, and so you can back off a little bit in that regard because they know they're going to do that, and maybe then you're able to dive more into some deeper training, or not deeper training, but maybe do some different modes of training that you wouldn't be able to with a group that's not as responsible or accountable. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Obviously, you're the king of one-liners, and for us in like our small circle, you've got one-liner that I think we all love, and I think we've all reiterated it at some point or another in our own worlds and our own teams and training, and that was do the basics savagely well. Um, like if you can just walk us through like what that truly means, because I think like it might mean a little bit of something different to somebody in every situation. So what does that mean like when you say that for your teams?
When I say that to my teams, the biggest thing is I don't believe in a whole lot of fluff work, doing the extra stuff just to say we're doing it. And I tell them I'm going to keep things simple. We're not going to do crazy stuff. You know, you're not going to be standing on some Bosu ball or have bands attached every which way you can imagine. But the stuff's simple. But the reason that it's, up on the screen is because it matters. And so We're not going to just go through the motions. We're going to do it savagely well, dial in, get it done, and that's the way we're going to do things. And I think um, one thing that I really took from Zach at TCU was it's more than just the training itself. It's the way you do a lot of things, whether it's starting behind the line, waiting on the whistle, staying with your group, just all those things that probably blend in more to the culture category rather than just training. It might not be moving the needle, but if you can get them all on that kind of train of, hey, this is how we do things and we're a collective unit, and being unified and dialing in the simple stuff and doing this really well, then the big stuff's going to be a lot easier down the road. And a lot of times the big stuff is more whatever they're doing in their sport. That's the stuff that really matters. But if I can't trust you to flip the E up on a dumbbell, then, can your teammates really trust you when you're the tie and run at the plate, 2 outs in the bottom of the 9th inning? That's
Like it's like taking care of the small shit details that you might overlook day to day. But when you get into it and you constantly are addressing those small details, now like those small details become so subconscious that like when you're in a moment that it's going to matter a lot more, it's already taken care of. You don't have to worry about trying to check those boxes because now they're just so used to it. Their order of process is like this, and this. I'm good. Now let's move to the next block, right?
right.
And I think, you and I have had a conversation about this, and you dropped me a really good note about this, and that was like your KPIs, right? And I think like what you have, I think is a genuinely hot take in sports performance. I don't think it's necessarily a bad one though, in the terms of the way you're framing the thought. I think at surface levels, it's going to gut check a lot of people.
Right.
But do you want me to kind of intro that, or do you feel like you're good to like kind of bring that in terms of like what your KPI is on that aspect?
I can bring this in. This was just a thought that I had, like, just to preface this. It's not necessarily something that I'm like, this is the foundation of our programming and our goals, but it was just a thought I had. Started talking through it with Brian. Is like everybody gets so upset, like as performance coaches, of like wins and losses don't matter, when in reality they kind of do. Like we're a supplement, right? We're support staff, and it's to hopefully, obviously, prepare the athletes, keep them healthy, all that stuff. But why do we do that? So that they can perform and hopefully win. And sometimes, just a thought I was having is, what does it take, like within your training and within what you can do within the weight room to help them be better out there? It might not even be just X's and O's in the weight room. It might be the way you structure things, kind of like I was talking about earlier, just with like the culture and the way you want things done. And does it align with that sport coach's values? So that way you're kind of preaching the same thing and you're instilling that culture, and they're hearing it from multiple different angles. It's not like, well, I hear one thing out here on the field and then I hear a different thing in the weight room. Like, no, you want to have that consistent voice, even if it's coming from different people, to hopefully where they're going to perform well out on the field. And it's like, as a KPI, like winning is what matters. That's what, if you're as an athlete, if you're able to help the team in whatever way, that's what's going to get you on the field, whether it's offensively, defensively, in whatever regard to whatever sport you want to talk about. Like, that's what matters, is you've got to be able to help the team win. Why should us as professionals not also take that into account in some regard? If it's something that you're like, hey, this probably isn't making them better, like I would regard that as fluff. Like, do you really need it then? It might not be X's and O's like moving the needle training wise, but it might be something mentally, something there that maybe you're getting, the athlete will get something out of it, so that then they can translate it into a more positive thing and be able to play better and hopefully lead to more wins.
So I guess now that kind of poses a question, like for Christian, right? In your position in the DR right now with the Cubs, like obviously like it's a little bit flip flopped. I would say, like, obviously you guys do care about your wins, but your sole purpose is to move them up in the X's and O's, the physical preparedness, the skill set preparedness, to then get them to the show, or single A, double A, triple A, whatever, high A, whatever it might be. And then that's when like it takes over again. Like, I think there is like a certain point where the X's and O's might overtake something, but at the top, when even if you look at it like a Division 1 school versus like the MLB, winning is what matters, because that's what moves you to that next level, versus like in like say like a developmental league like you're in right now. Like, you're worried about them getting, like, it's almost like the stages of athletic development where they're in like the train to train, the train to compete, and then that train to win kind of stage. Like, obviously it's a little bit different, but it's kind of paralleled with each other, where like in college baseball, you're in that train to compete, almost train to win almost all the time, unless it's like a freshman who might redshirt, isn't really going to play, we're just learning how to train to train. We might be in the train to train to compete in that those lower levels of the like professional baseball. But like, what do you think about that, Christian?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we've talked about this before as well. Like the emphasis down here is more so on developing players versus just winning at all costs. We have two teams down here, so we have a good amount of players. Like in a college baseball game, you're gonna throw the pitchers that you're gonna think are gonna be the best shot at winning that game. Versus here, like we have our people that like our starters and our people that are kind of solidified as the people that are kind of our top guys. But like these guys need to pitch every so often, so sometimes that happens where like we're in a close game and a guy that probably doesn't give us the best chance to win is in the game because that's a development opportunity for him. And I think, I've said this before, like, yeah, like it's cool to win down here, but no one really cares or even like knows who wins the DSL championship. Like that does exist, but people aren't like people aren't bragging about that. What people care about in pro baseball is like big league wins, and everything under that is trying to contribute to that. So I'd say like here the emphasis is definitely development, and then the higher you go up, the more that emphasis shifts from development to winning, and then ideally they're at their most developed state once they get to the big leagues. Obviously that doesn't always happen, some guys go up faster than others. And I think there's something to be said about like big leaguers still can improve physically as well, so it's definitely interesting. And I think you could also look at it through the lens of what is a win down here. Maybe a win for us is we're getting more players from the academy onto the rosters in the US because, there's some teams that are a lot better at, international scouting and getting players from, the DR, all those other Latin countries up through their system and into the big leagues. Like you'll notice that some teams have more Latin players in the bigs than others. And, that's usually kind of a representation of how they develop people from the bottom up, in my opinion. So that could be a win for a team, not just wins and losses, but like an organizational or a developmental win could be okay. We have a lot more guys coming through our academy and getting up to higher levels and contributing to big league wins than other teams, and more importantly than we have in the past. So I think that's one thing that obviously it's still baseball, but it's a little bit of apples to oranges, like baseball versus college. Like yeah, all the affiliate levels and everything else, they have playoffs. There's a championship, but at the end of the day they're trying to contribute to those big league wins. And I think you can kind of look at that as college. Like you have your guys that are like freshman, sophomore, maybe they're red shirts, maybe their focus is more on development in the hopes of, okay, by the time this guy's a junior and senior, he's really going to be contributing to more overall team wins versus, we don't need them to be good right away. If they are and they're ready, that's great. But I think the same thing could be said for college. Like an athlete hopefully becomes more physically developed and skillfully developed as they go throughout their career, and the emphasis is more on field performance and not as much on weight room. That's why people do red shirts. Like you're not going to play the whole entire year, why not hit the weight room hard, try to develop physically if that's the thing that's holding you back, as well as work on some of that skill stuff.
I guess would one way to be, and you can both correct me if I'm wrong, call me a dumbass, however you feel. I'm okay with that. But I like while you guys were talking, like looking at this from like my perspective as interim baseball performance coach for about a month and a half. But like
That's right.
that's like the extent of where I've been in the baseball realm. Granted, one of the most fun teams to train, especially Elon baseball. Those guys get after it. The culture that is there is astounding. They're great guys. They train hard, incredible. But from like I said, like a more outside perspective, like looking at this, you would almost kind of view, one piece that you said, Christian, is that at the major league, that's when wins and losses like matter. That's the KPIs, like wins and losses. Instead of looking at, you know, on your side of things as, there's the majors, there's the big league ball, and then each of those sub levels. That's almost like instead of looking at it as like each different teams, it's all just the Cubs, which I'm assuming that's kind of like how they view it anyway. I might just be trying to like interpret it to, a layman idiot's point of view. But like you're all the Cubs. Your DR league, that might be your freshman red shirts. They're in that development. They're just an elongated fall ball. Yeah, they're playing games, but like those games are more so to develop the skill set to then get them up to those higher levels as they go through the program, and then they kind of move up, and then they get to where the winning matters. But that win is still the organization as a whole. That's those KPIs, right? Whereas like the smaller subsections, like your KPIs are to move them up to get them to that point to where they are contributing to wins and losses in some positive fashion, right? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but do you guys think that that would be a way to good kind of compare them, as it not being so much apples to oranges?
One thing that I kind of thought of when both of y'all were explaining that too is like, I brought up the KPIs wins thing, but that may not be necessarily what you focus on all year. The same way
Mm-hmm.
that Christians, talking about like at the lower levels, it is more development based. I think about it from like in a chronological sequence in college, the fall, that's a development time on all there's nothing that you're playing to win. Not saying that the guys aren't competing daily, they're competing for spots, they're competing for this, but at the end of the day, it's just to work on your game. As far as on the field. And then in here, it's, training to be the most prepared you can at the beginning of the season. But then, you transition to the spring, and that's when winning does matter. Again, you're going to have those red shirts and those young guys that, hey, during the spring, they're still going to probably just keep training hard because that's what they need and that's what they're going to get the most out of. And they're probably not contributing that much on the field. But then your older guys, too, like, it's like, hey, are you contributing to this team and are you healthy? And that's what matters. And that's so that kind of dictates your training.
Yeah. And
Okay.
I think another thing to be said is like the timelines can be a little bit different. You know, generally you get 4 years of college eligibility. COVID kind of threw a wrench in that. There's people getting 7, 8 years of college eligibility, which is wild. But for the most people, they're going to get 4 to 5 years. They have a red shirt. So that's a little bit different than someone who could take that amount of time, 4 or 5 years, to even go through the whole farm system in a pro baseball organization and then play another 5, 10, however many years in the big league. So that timeline is a lot more stretched out. So that's another thing to consider. Like, and this can kind of lead into our question of like transitioning athletes from more foundational means to more advanced training means. And I think one thing that gets kind of misconstrued in pro baseball is that since we know that they're advanced in their sport, you can kind of think they're also advanced physically when they're not. And this is when, especially when you see people go up through the levels super quick, there's guys that are getting to the big leagues at like 20, 21 years old. And like I don't know, I don't care what they've been doing. Like it's tough. It'd be tough to convince me that those guys are a fully physically developed advanced athlete. Skill wise, sport wise, absolutely. They're obviously there for a reason. But I think that's one thing where I was talking about. I think big leaguers can still develop because they might go through the system super quick and they're really good at baseball, but they still may be undertrained physically and they still have a lot of room to go. So I think the timelines are obviously a lot different. You know, pro sports teams will go through rebuilding phases where they might just be terrible, getting high draft picks, and they're kind of building for the future. Whereas like college, like you can't really do that. Maybe a little bit more with like NIL if you're a big school. Like you can just go out and get a guy for a bunch of money that's going to make an immediate impact. But obviously, you're trying to win every year and develop at the same time. So that's kind of something that's a little interesting to think about. Be curious to hear your take on that, Kel.
Um, this is something that I actually took from Andrew Benham. Is I was talking with him because he's a guy that I talk to a lot anyway, just as a friend, but also like as a mentor. Like, hey, what do you think about this? What should I do in this situation? And like trying to figure out different uh, categories of programming and kind of the way you're going to bucket guys. And he said something that really like opened my eyes to thinking about what's going on. And it was really just like at the end of the day, whether like you said, the guy's really good at the sport, as far as in college, like they're all 18 to 22-year-old kids. Like, are they really an advanced athlete as far as your training goes? Are they really advanced? Like that junior might be really good, but he's only 21. Like there's no way that he's just completely tapped out from training. So does his programming really need to look that much different? He might need different things, but does it really need to look that much different than the 18-year-old freshman? Kind of opened my eyes a little bit, made me think a little bit of like sometimes it's like a little bit more, hey, keep it simple, stupid. Like, not saying that you aren't going to differentiate, but it doesn't have to be something crazy.
I think that'll also kind of lead true to like when you're actually programming, say, especially on like I guess we'll kind of say like from the Olympic side versus on the football side, right? Um, and I think even at Elon, we do it on the football side too, to where your advanced card and your foundation card and your foundation plus and your advanced plus, like they don't differ too much, right? It's still the same structure. You might swap a variation one for another or add like an extra constraint to something or change some loading parameters, but the cards themselves really look similar. We're just using the same methods to maybe in a different variation to provide a slightly different stimulus for a different type of athlete. And I think like, obviously not a big, I'm the odd man out here. I'm the minority. I'm not truly like a, working with baseball for an elongated period of time, in track and field. I'm looking at it like, well, my advanced card, I'm not necessarily pushing so much strength as a strength deficit athlete because they're probably good enough at that point to where I want to get them to load and redirect in as fast as possible. So I'm going to lighten the load, maybe have velocity drop offs, things like that. But they're both split squatting. It's just maybe a little bit of sets and reps are going to differ, or even just the loading on those sets and reps. One of them's going to be at 60 to 65%. One of them's going to be at 75 to 80%, whatever it might be, and kind of pushing that needle. But they'll look the same. They'll look the same on the surface level. And I think that kind of leads true to like what you guys are saying, to where, how truly advanced are they? Do they need something extremely different, right? We don't have to add, a double banded setup with, from the top rope, from the bottom, over speed on something else. Like we can probably apply that same method or something a little bit more simple to everybody that they'll still get some kind of benefit from without making it harder on yourself, number one, and still giving the appropriate stimulus to the athlete that they'll need at the time, just to make sure that everything is kind of covered. And like you said, do the basics savagely well. Like, it's tried and true when it comes to things that the volume and the consistency will drive the adaptation that you're trying to seek, right? There's no magic pill of an exercise. There's no magic pill of a workout. Things can induce a specific adaptation. It's just PAP. If you want to get that and you want to increase a slight, go into a myosin light chain reaction and have a little bit more motor unit recruitment and motor unit sequencing on a specific piece. That's great, but that's only going to be, that 24-hour period at most, fingers crossed, once that research kind of gets published. But, them coming in there and hitting something, I think Renaissance Periodization, Dr. Mike, he mentioned like you hit one movement pattern once a week, right? Say you train like a squat pattern once a week. If you train it twice a week, you're going to get 1.5 times roughly the growth and stimulus that you want to drive the adaptation, right? They need to be able to hit that consistently over time. And you're going to see more from that than if you were to just constantly rifle through things in different variations. If you go from, I'm not an Olympic guy, but if you go from a split squat to a power clean to a rack pull to a squat, a pin squat to a trap bar deadlift, and you're cycling those out every single 2 weeks versus keeping that same movement pattern, maybe loading it differently and moving through that. I think that's like a better way to look at things. And I know I might just be rambling and you guys can just cut me off. But it's the same. I think that serves like the purpose of, it's not so, to quote the Green Goblin, "You're not so different, you and I, Spider-Man." But I think that serves its purpose. And it's like, another thing that we've talked about too, Kell and Christian, I would love to hear your opinion on this too, because I think this might be another like kind of controversial one too, is, Kell, you and I have talked about med balls, specifically in terms of like with baseball. I think med balls are a great utility. They're a great piece of equipment, and I think they have a lot of versatility, and we can get a lot out of them. But I think when we think about in baseball, you made a really good point, and that's like the weight of the med ball and the speed at which it moves. Does it warrant enough? Does it actually get what we're trying to attain in that aspect with like rotational power, or is there a better way to attack that in another simple, not overly complex variation to do that? If you want to just kind of take it from there, explain to me what your thought process is on that. And then Christian, I'd love to hear like yours as well, and then kind of let that go from there.
So, preface, still throw med balls, do think they're a great tool. But just again, like thoughts I've had, if you look at the speed at which somebody, let's say, throws or hits at, like the speed of that rotation, let's take the throwing for an instance. The load that they're under right there is they've got a 5-ounce baseball in their hand, right? That's what they're moving. Everything else is just the body moving really fast. Then even think about the lightest med ball that you're probably going to throw. It's probably 2-4 pounds, right? That's light. You're able to move at a higher velocity because that's what you're chasing, is more towards that like speed of that adaptation that you're trying to elicit. However, it's not really touching. You're not doing anything faster than what they do out there. With that bucket's already overflowing the amount of rotations they get at like high velocities. So maybe it's not worth trying to find a way that they're actually moving faster so that they can continue to move that needle and rotate faster out on the field, as a caveat. However, also it's like if you're going slower, but there's not enough load, like in a 6-pound med ball, there's really not that much load, and you're moving slower, it's almost like, could that be classified as like a medium output? It's not high from a load perspective. It's also not high from a speed. So it's kind of just the middle ground. Just kind of a thought I've had, like, is it really eliciting an adaptation? With some of that, I do think some of it, because it is heavier, it might be just a sequencing thing. It's more controlled. They can still hopefully learn to sequence really well. And so they're getting some kind of neurological adaptation out of it. Maybe it's not just completely physical. But yeah, I don't know. That was something that one day, I know we talked about it a little bit, Brian, but just something I was kind of chewing on. And maybe I think some of it too is it's probably an easy thing to have, or easy thing to find out if you have like a motion capture lab and you're able to actually break down and see speeds and see the way the different limbs are moving on, whatever kind of med ball throw you want, as well as like let's say a pitcher getting down the mound. But then again, then you might just be comparing apples to oranges. And so.
Yeah, that's that's similar to how I think of it. Like, obviously, we know like what we do in the weight room is more general towards the bottom of that like Bondarchuk period, and then like the skill coaches will live towards more towards the top of that pyramid. They might come down a little bit towards the bottom, a little bit. We might go a little bit towards the top, maybe not as much, but every once in a while, as far as like more specific exercises. But I think you make a really good point, and I agree with it as far as like the velocities you're going to get from a med ball, no matter how light it is, like it's not going to touch bat speed. It's not going to touch pitch velocity. And I don't know if it necessarily has to. I am kind of the opinion that like using more than probably like a 4 to 6 pound med ball and kind of using, you know, heavier stuff. I don't know if it's you're getting out of it what you want. Like you said, it might be too much middle ground. Like we have a bunch of med balls down here. Anywhere from I think 6 is actually the lightest. I wish we had some 4s and 2s, but then we have them up to like 20 pounds, and they almost never get used. And I just don't like find myself asking like, why do we have all these like heavy ass med balls? Just because that's kind of the way I think of it. Like, I do think they're good to like still be able to train like spinal rotation and stuff like that within training outside of the actual sport, especially when you're in more of an off-season phase where they may not be like throwing as much, hitting as much. Um, and again, they're not going to be super fatiguing. They don't take a lot of time within your training. They're easy to pair with stuff. And if anything else, like they can be used as like a good like warm up or even like primer to something more intense that will probably get you closer to that adaptation. So I don't necessarily see them as like a waste of time. I think they can be a good use of time. But like you said, like it's not going to touch those velocities. So I think using the lighter med balls, unless you're going for more like extensive and like rhythmic work, then maybe use a little bit heavier. But you're more so going for like accumulation and like maybe more aerobic conditioning at that point. So like I said, I think there's definitely merit to using them. But if you think that you're gonna I mean, if you think using any one implement or exercise is going to directly improve pitch speed or bat speed, I think you're kind of missing the forest for the trees. But I do think it can be a good part in like a holistic training program if that kind of makes sense.
No, I 100% agree with everything you just said. And when I say that I still throw med ball, I'm probably never going to take them out. Like
Exactly.
just calling it like
Same.
it is. But however, like it is just something that like thinking about it, and some of it too is like if you were going to actually touch those velocities, then it's probably moving too high up. Like on you mentioned Bondarchuk's period, it's probably you're probably going more towards that competitive exercise piece anyway versus staying lower on the pyramid and it being a lot more general uh, preparedness, which is typically what we cover in the weight room. Um,
Mhm.
so
Yeah, and at that point you would just practice a sport probably anyway. So it's like
exactly.
no, yeah, like I think they're good. I think it's good to know like what they're actually doing though. I think some people do them and probably still do them correctly, but with the thought that, oh, I'm improving bat speed, I'm improving fastball velocity. Probably not directly at least, but just
Right.
knowing what's general, what's specific, I think is helpful in that situation.
Sorry, had to cough. I guess like when it comes to like your big blocks, um, you know, strength obviously is one of them. Speed is one of them. I'm assuming in some way, shape, or form, we want an aspect of like movement competency or that like the ability to actually find different ranges of motion, understand and adapt quickly. That neuroplasticity aspect of like if you threw them into something, would they be easily able to adapt, or is it going to take them 2-3 weeks to try and figure this movement out? Um, that last piece with that, I think that's a really big forgotten piece. I think in a lot of sports trainings, which like a lot of people don't stray from even just that like sagittal plane of like we're gonna squat, we're gonna hinge, we're gonna press, we're gonna pull. You know, what are like between the two of you guys, like in their different situations, like what are the ways that you are trying to, I guess, like improve that like movement competency and the ability to adapt quickly to like a new movement stimulus or something that you might just throw in, whether that be in a warm up, the actual workout. What does that look like? How do you try to accomplish that? And like when you look at it, how do you know if it's working or not? Like walk me through that if you guys don't mind.
Christian, I'll let you go on
Y-
this.
Yeah. So obviously you're gonna have, or at least I have. I think we have kind of similar thoughts on like making sure that you have all the movement categories within your program in some capacity at all times. You're going to emphasis some of them at different times over others, but for me, it's stuff like crawls. I think because obviously, like if you're going to do like squats, hinges, pushes, pulls, you're going to be doing those on a consistent basis. It's tough to, as long as you have like quality coaching there, it's tough to not like get competent at those. Some are going to be a little bit more difficult than others. Like some guys just struggle to squat deep. Some guys just struggle to get into like a front rack position, stuff like that. Some guys will struggle to get like fully overhead with like, especially with like baseball players. But I think like putting them in like warm ups or like I guess you could call it like an activation series if you want to call it, just extension of the warm up before a workout. So like for me, that's stuff like crawls, like variable like med ball stuff. So like maybe not like a med ball throw where you could are like looking to just produce the most amount of power, just not like a slam, but like okay, maybe if you stand with like a split stance and throw it like overhead or something like that, just different angles and stuff like that. More variation, kind of falling under that term of like increasing like movement literacy or like movement bandwidth, stuff like that. You do it with rolls as well. I think another thing that kind of gets overlooked is like playing games. That's something that we've been kind of incorporating a little bit more into our training is like whether it be small sided games or just like we've been playing like capture the flag once a week here. Like I think we can get a little bit too I think it's important, but you can
Structured.
get too, yeah, you can get, I do think structure is important, but I think you can get too deep into the weeds with like everything has to be programmed and nothing's actually like just going out there and just be an athlete, just play. Especially with like the younger population, I think these kids are that we're dealing with are 17 to 20 for the most part, and like they don't they haven't played any other sports. Like they just have played baseball. Like having them play those games is actually probably just as good, if not better, than doing like structured change of direction work, stuff like that. So like things like that, capture the flag, ultimate frisbee, two ball, like more in the baseball realm, just stuff like that. Incorporating that in like 5-10 minutes, like in a warm up. I think that it's tough. It's tougher to measure the impact that stuff's having, but I don't think that that's a reason to not do them, especially with like you see when people get super specialized, they're really good at that sport, but they can still be a bad athlete if that makes sense. Like they can still kind of move really bad. They just know how to swing really well, or they just know how to pitch, but they're a bad athlete. Like we have plenty of guys here that kind of like they may throw gas or they may be a really good hitter, but like they move like shit. And it's like, why not like regress them to the point where it's like, yo, like this is stuff you probably would have done in like PE class if you grew up in the States and you didn't have that. So I'm gonna give that to you now. And it's probably gonna help you. So I think it would be a little bit different if I was back at Elon, but I think if I went back there now, I'd probably take a little bit of that into back into the college realm. So curious to see what your take on that is.
I'm I'm really like kind of right there with you. I agree. Like crawls, there's plenty of variations that you can do. That also that you said rolls, another great one. Jumps too. I think jumps are so there's a million different ways to jump, and it's like just how can you challenge them to maybe switch up their strategy and do something that maybe is a little bit less planned.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the specialization thing. All these kids, they typically, by the time they're 15, they're just playing one sport, and like they get really good at that sport. But once you take that glove off their hand or take a bat out of their hands, like in a baseball sense, it's like then you ask them to shoot a free throw. It's like, ugh, like, like
Yeah.
what is that? Like, oh, I mean, so I think just anything that you can do where you can challenge them, where it's almost something like there's like really a beauty in them being able to just like see something on the fly, and it's like, hey, I've got to figure out a strategy to be successful. Versus something that it's like, oh, well, I have time and I can practice and continuously get better. And like crawls, rolls, and jumps are just a huge one that I think is like really easy to implement. Um, it does get tough, like from a structure standpoint. Like here, when we have 41 guys in the weight room, it's tough to throw something out there that's super like novel and maybe a little bit outside the box, just because then that structure piece like maybe loses or subtracts, and then stuff's not as efficient. You can't get stuff done in a timely manner. So it's like a very fine line to walk, but there's always I definitely agree. There's so much merit in challenging them at things that they don't get introduced to. I think about it, it's just like it's a bucket, just another bucket of the stuff that mirrors baseball is overflowing, and it's overflowing probably at all points in the year. But how can you challenge them with the stuff that they don't get and try to hopefully even out that bucket a little bit? Just through there's a million different variations, whether it's movements in the weight room or stuff in the warm up, but they have to be challenged, not just physically, but just mentally, and figure out things that they haven't had to think about before.
Right. Yeah, it's like solving movement solutions, I guess, is a way you could
Yes.
put it. Like, and like we did it at Elon with football, played like the t-shirt game, stuff like that. That shit's really fun. And it's also like, I mean, that's perception action right there. That's the OODA loop. So I think, and I think people can overlook it for something like baseball because, with a sport like basketball or soccer or football, it is a lot more dynamic in the
Hmm.
sense that like you can have a different formation, you can run an endless amount of plays versus like baseball, the play is always initiated with, the pitch and
Hmm.
either the ball's put into play or it's not. So it's a lot more, I don't even want to call it predictable, but like from that aspect it is. But I still think that that's valuable for those kind of guys because they're not getting that within probably practice, and they still do have to react to like shortstop has to react to a ground ball and be able to in an instantaneous moment be able to find the quickest way to try to make a play with that ball and then get the out at first. So
Right. And one that I left out too is traveling skills. Another great one to mix it up, and that's something that I try to change up daily. Is just A, it doesn't get stale, and B, there's just so many different variations that you can do, and
Mhm.
it challenges them. And it's like they have a lot of fun with it. There'll be one guy who can't figure it out in a warm up, and he's the only guy that has to keep restarting. And the guys are chirping him, and you know what I mean. And it kind of like turns the pressure on a little bit, but it kind of makes it fun because then they're into it. But then also that guy, you're like, hey, you're on the spot right here. You've got to figure it out, or else the other 38 guys, they're gonna keep picking on you a little bit. And it's all in good heart and good fun, but uh, I do think it kind of like triggers something in your brain, and it makes you have to figure out and kind of be okay with being uncomfortable and being on the spot.
yeah, yeah, and
You
compete
almost
under
like,
pressure as well.
Yeah.
yeah, you almost induce the fight or flight response of like, will they fold or will they go? And that kind of goes back to, what we talked about earlier in the episode, like your, like that culture standpoint or like that mental side of things of like, hey, pressure's on. I got to figure it out. I have to
Hmm.
do this. I have to do the right thing. So now I have to just organize and go. And I think that's like a big piece. Like it just feeds back into like what you had mentioned earlier. Um, there is Christian. I don't know if you have any questions or anything that you want to talk about.
I guess one thing that I wanted to, because this is unique. I know Brian mentioned it earlier. Is like you did win a national championship as a player. How does having had played the sport of baseball and at a high level, how does that impact the way you look at things, coaching, programming? Do you think it helps? Like, do you think it provides like a lens that helps you be a better coach? Or
Um, I think it helps just being familiar with the game. 100%. I tell people this sometimes, like I've been doing the strength and conditioning thing, through internships for a couple years now. But before that, I was a baseball guy the entire time. Like I've been a baseball guy a lot longer than I've been a strength and conditioning guy. Um, and so like it's just the truth of it. But with that, now daily I'm trying to better myself on the strength and conditioning side and learning those pieces, and that's what I'm actively like trying to achieve. But having the background with baseball, um, I do think it helps because I'm able to easily put myself in like when we have lift after practice, I know exactly what the body feels like because I've been there. You know what I mean? Going into a lift like directly after practice, and I try to put myself, hey, I've got this 15-minute warm up that's nice and it's clean and it's checks all my boxes, but then I can put myself, do we really need that? Like, do we need a warm up? They've just been on their feet for 3.5 hours. Like, we don't need this, this, and this. You know what I mean? Like, and I think it can help things like be more efficient. Um, Understanding to like the way I think it helps to understand the way that coaches think. Um, because at the end of the day, like if your relationship with the coach isn't good, then it's gonna just make your life harder. So like understanding the way that like baseball coaches think and what they want to see, what they do, how can we implement those things, and so kind of like everybody's happy. Whether it's something that maybe isn't perfect from a performance side, um, or maybe it's something that is good and it's just like finding a different way or a different avenue to implement that so they're happy. I think that holds merit. Um, and so I do think it helps um, because, I've worked with other sports too that I'm not as familiar with, and then that hurts because I think of everything a little bit more on the baseball side, and it's like there's some other sports that I'm not as familiar with, and so you got to kind of play catch up, which I think is something that on the performance side, a lot of performance coaches are always feel like they're playing catch up to figure out the sport, and so I do think like having a deeper knowledge of like the sport, it kind of helped me in this aspect now that I do work with baseball. Um, just because I don't have to spend as much time trying to understand the sport because I have worked with other sports that I do not understand or do not have a deep knowledge of, and it can be a real how do I put
Like
it?
a barrier.
Yeah, you almost feel like you're doing the athletes a disservice because you don't understand the sport as good as them and the coaches, and you probably never will. And you're playing catch up, and then you look back after a year and you're like, man, those first couple months our training was not what it needed to be because I wasn't as familiar. And doing a needs analysis, uh, a couple months before our training started just isn't enough. And it's kind of like a harsh reality of it. It's just the way the industry is, and I don't, you know what I mean. You can't if you've got 2 months to prepare for working with a new team, you can't learn everything there is to know about that sport in those 2 months, especially with athletes that have played that sport their whole lives and coaches that have played it and coached it for even longer. So I don't know.
It's
Um,
just it's a tough, harsh reality, and like that's the
right.
same extent of like, well, I got my 4 year, quadrennial plan, my athletic development plan. Um, but like in all reality, if you're not there for the full time, you're not gonna be able to implement everything. It's the same
Right.
thing as if you think you have an idea during that needs analysis of like this is what the sport is, this is what it is, but now you're 2 months in, you're starting to talk to them about more intricacies about like the even for the athletes, just being an expert in their sport itself. And you're like, I never thought about it that way. I never looked at it in this way, shape, or form. And it's a lot easier when you are the athlete that has gone through that, because now you have both frames of reference as the coach, as the athlete, and you like, and working through that skill, working through the sport itself. And you're like, well, I know how that should feel.
Hmm.
You're not kind of guessing, and you don't have to test as much. I think it's still good to test, but like, when an extremely heavy day like might affect your shoulder, like if you're doing like an upper body heavy day,
Hmm.
what that might affect, like the feeling of when you throw, or if you have a ton of deep squatting and you're being a catcher, like what that's going to feel like the next 3-4 days. You have that frame of reference to like take in as context for when you program versus like, well, I just want to make them stronger. That's great, but like you had mentioned before, it's like we're a supplement to what they're doing. We need them to be successful in their sport. Having that context allows you to do the right thing at the right time.
Hmm.
I think that's a big piece that ends up getting missed a lot when a lot of, and that's like you said, a harsh reality of the industry. When people have to just jump into a role, they might not know the most about that sport, and then they feel like they're doing a disservice, or the athletes might not believe in them as much because they're doing the best they can. They just don't know because
Right.
we're ignorant on whatever that might be. I guess my last piece of this is for the both of you guys. Like, one thing that we've always talked about, I think, like in our circles, depending on when we communicate to each other, whether that be in the office or just through text messages or even talking on here, Christian, we test a lot of different things. So like right now for you guys, like what is something that you guys have been like, I guess, kind of tinkering with in that idea or that aspect of like what's something you're really looking for to see if like there's merit to training or like getting into the program. Like what is that? Like walk me through like what your process is, why you're kind of going after chasing that rabbit, and how you're doing it, and what you're kind of like thinking on the aspect once you found a little bit of results.
Christian, you want to go?
Yeah. So I guess there's two ways to really look at it. Like one, experimenting with like your own training, and then ideally like taking from that and giving it to your athletes if you think it is worth it. Obviously, like it's kind of, you kind of toe a fine line because there's however many there's like a million ways you can do training for various goals. You're probably never going to try all of them out on yourself before you and be like, okay, this works, now I'll give them to my athletes, because they're probably also not going to respond the same way you are. But for me, it's like I have to be like interested in that said topic. So like whatever I'm interested in at the time, like it might start with like reading like a book or a bunch of articles, or even watching like some YouTube videos about like how to train for hypertrophy, how to target speed in the early off season. And then I think it's trying it out on yourself and then being like, okay, does this make sense? Seeing how your body reacts to it. I obviously, and you guys do now have force plates as well now too. That's another big thing. Like you can see more of that. One, you can see how it feels. Two, you can see kind of that objective feedback, and you can even do that with like a jump mat. Um, Obviously, if you're training for speed, seeing if your times are getting faster, your top speed's getting increased, and then kind of implementing that within your program. Obviously, you might not want to go full on with that, but like we've talked about it before, like 85-90% of your program tried and true, and then that 10 to 15% as far as experimental. But like for me, like the guy I work with down here, um, we train together. It's awesome to have a training partner. We'll kind of like plan out, like sometimes we'll do something similar to what the guys are doing, but sometimes we'll do something completely different. And it's cool because like we'll jump on the force plates at least once a week, if not a couple times, and kind of see how that affects us. And then we can kind of look forward to that for what we're doing with our team. So there's definitely a lot of ways you can go about it. But for me, it's like I have to be like interested in something. Like if it's something where it's like, I don't know, like something that just seems dry to me at that point and I'm not interested in it, it's tough for me to really get into it. Doesn't mean that it's not important. Like it could just mean that maybe I'll be interested in it at a different time. Obviously, like there's some stuff where it's like, okay, I need to learn about this now. You just kind of bear down and do it. But for me, it always starts with like curiosity, doing a little research, and then just messing around, whether it's in the weight room, whether it's just kind of trying out different exercises or actually like running a program for multiple weeks, and then seeing how I felt, seeing how numbers changed, seeing if it was actually like enjoyable, and then seeing if it's actually practical for a team setting. Because a lot of times like you can do stuff in your own training, especially like down here, like I overlook stuff because it's like, okay, I've been training for how many years and I kind of have a little bit of a background in the stuff. That doesn't always mean that it's going to be that easily explained to a 17-year-old Dominican kid that has hardly trained
Doesn't
in
speak
his
English.
life. Yeah, and so it's a whole nother can of worms there. But that's kind of my process. It usually always stems from curiosity, and it could also be from like something that I just have if I'm having a conversation with you, or like if I'm talking to Gabe or someone and they say something that makes me think, I'll be like, oh shoot, maybe I'll look into this, and then that comes part of it. So what about you,
Okay.
Kell?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I mean, curiosity of whether it's something to read, watch, or Brian knows I'd probably bug him to death, like walking into his office. Hey man, so I've been thinking about this, and then like, hey, can you come try this? What do you think about this? This is what I'm thinking. Yeah, I'm right there with you. It's just like playing around with it on yourself, making sure that it's something that you can implement, with a team. And what are you giggling at?
No one else caught that, but you're like playing around with it on yourself.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yo.
Hey, yo. Hey, sometimes
Yeah.
you just got to play with yourself.
Yeah.
He's cooked. He's cooked.
Yeah.
Clip that.
Oh.
I just
Yeah,
blew your train of thought.
Yeah, I'm gonna be super conscious there, about everything now. But yeah, just figuring out what works the best, what's feasible, what you can do efficiently, and what makes the most sense. Because I do think there's value in trying different things out. For me, I think it's important to, like, if you take a step back and look at yourself from a career point, I think us as like young coaches, it's important to play around right now, because reality wise, 15 years from now, am I still going to be playing around? Yes, but I want my system at that point to be pretty dialed in. You know what I mean? Right now, I'm still trying to figure out all that stuff. What's the most efficient version of my system, and what are things that I continue to come up with that remain non-negotiables? Obviously, the main things that we know about performance will still stay the main things. The things that have been the main things for the last 30 to 40 years are probably still going to be the main things 30 to 40 years from now. But that 15% that we're playing around with right now in the program, what if, hopefully 10 years from now, it's 5% that you're experimenting around with? Like, how do you close that gap? Because that 10%, you're like, I don't need to experiment with that anymore. I've kind of done as much as I can, and I've figured out what I like, what works for the athletes, and what's worth it and what's not worth doing. That's kind of the way I think about all that stuff.
Like that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Should we wrap this bad boy up? I know Kell and I got to get to a lift here soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got to do nothing for the rest of the day and just be a bum, but
Ain't nothing wrong with that, brother. You work hard.
oh, yeah. No, dude, this was good. We got to a lot. There's definitely some questions we didn't get to, so I definitely see a part 2 in the future. If you're down for it, we'd love to have you. 'Cause, yeah, this
Big
was
time.
good stuff, dude. So
I
what I forgot about that energy drink. What are we thinking on that?
think we all forgot about it. Gut check reaction, 8.8. Tastes just like Welch's grape juice. It's lightly carbonated. Can look sick. Same price as Ghost Energy everywhere else. It's the same Ghost Energy blend. Obviously, it's just a different flavor variation. Love the purple. It reminds me of like I don't know what this is, like the child in me, but it reminds me of like the old Power Ranger purple.
Mm.
Shit goes hard. So 8.8. 8.8 on the Welch's grape. One of the top tier flavors up there. But again, Kell, we really appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming on with us. I would definitely love a part two, just to dive deeper and deeper into this stuff and bring you back with us. Follow us on Instagram. It is bevboys.tv, of course. I am B Shakuski, BSZUTKOWSKI. French is
French_fit40 on Instagram.
Definitely follow Coach Kell here. Kell, what can you drop your Instagram handle?
Kell_3_Smith.
There we go. Obviously, like and subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on Spotify. We are on Spotify as well with the full video on Spotify and YouTube. You can go ahead and go on there. Of course, you want to check out one of the greatest websites that you could ever go to in the entire world. It is bevboys.com, BEVBOIS. Get yourself a Pall Mall sweatshirt, Pall Mall hoodie, Pall Mall t-shirt, any of the original OG Pop That Top t-shirts. There's going to be more coming out there. But overall, this was absolutely astounding. I loved it. Thank you very much, Kell. Thank you, Christian, for bearing with us with the daylight savings time on the DR time. And
literally on an island. So
yeah,
had no idea. Forgot about it.
Thank you all for having me.
We'll see you in the next one.
Sounds good.
Peace.
Peace.